This webinar is on vulnerability disclosure, and our aim is really to give you an understanding of new guidance, technical standards and upcoming regulation throughout the world. And this is focusing on the mechanism of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So we'll talk about what that is, how to be prepared for it, and how to operate it, a scheme of coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I'm just going to take you very briefly through the standards and regulation part of this, and then we'll have a brief set of questions and then move on to David's more technical, in-depth presentation. So the big problem with vulnerability disclosure is that most companies don't have one. And this is based on research done here in the UK, but it's fairly consistent across many research bodies, which means that if security researchers or even consumers discover a vulnerability in a product or service, they don't have an easy way to report it and make it better. That is changing. When you see that sort of level of market failure, normally regulation follows. And what we're seeing today and what I'm going to be talking about is two aspects. One is work on shoring up the technical standards, and that is through the ETSI EN 303645 instrument, which is the first international standard of its kind. And also regulation. Now I've set up here, there's a couple of statewide regulations in Oregon and California in the United States. There's ongoing proposals, call for views now from the United Kingdom, proposing to regulate consumer IoT devices, but also in the Asia Pacific region. Australia has just come out with some voluntary non-binding codes of practice. Singapore also is active in this area. And these regulations vary in their intensity and specificity. However, they are all the principles are very similar. And as well as regulation, there is a lot of advice and good practice around. We have produced some quick guides. I'll give you the link to those later on. There's best practice guides also produced by the Internet of Things Security Foundation and in the UK by our National Cybersecurity Centre. There's, as I mentioned, a draft code of practice in Australia, very accessible, very high level, but also extremely consistent with the main principles that we see in the ETSI standard. So the ETSI standard, this is a technical standard. So from a lawyer's point of view, which is my background, it's not a binding instrument. It is there to guide people as they're setting up their IoT devices or creating them. But it's a very important and very influential standard because what we see is that the legislation around the world is either referring to it implicitly or explicitly. And even the standard itself says that as IoT products become increasingly secure, it is envisioned that future revisions of this document will mandate provisions that are currently recommendations. That has to be understood in the context of it being a technical standard and non-binding. However, the legislation will be making binding, will be making mandatory things that appear in that standard. In brief, the standard is covering three aspects which are reflected in this webinar series: no universal default passwords, keeping software updated, and implementing a means of managing reporting vulnerabilities. But there's a lot more in there, and it goes into more and more depth And so the other aspects are securely storing sensitive security parameters, communicating securely, and minimizing exposed attack surfaces. To many of you who will be involved in the cybersecurity world, none of these are particularly surprising. What's perhaps surprising is the gap between the regulatory and technical aspiration and what we're seeing in the market. So because we're coming from the United Kingdom, I'll just give you a sense of what is currently being proposed in the legislation here. And I do that if you're not from the region as an example of the kind of legislation and regulatory proposals that we are seeing throughout the world, because they're all fairly consistent. So the scope of the regulation applies to network connectable consumer IoT products. There are various products that are deemed out of scope of the regulation, and that tends to be in the area of healthcare or automotive IoT, where there is already a regulatory regime in place. But the real test, if you're looking at these proposals, will be whether or not the product has one or more network interfaces that can receive or transmit digital data. Of course, we talk about the consumer market, but particularly in the small, medium-sized enterprise, and in fact throughout, a lot of these smart products will be in use by businesses as well. So what does it do? The proposal is to set out a duty of care for distributors and obligations for producers. And products that don't meet the obligations set out in the legislation, it is proposed that they should not be supplied or made available to consumers on the UK market. And that's quite a harsh sanction. What we see in, the sanctions are not yet fixed, but there is an escalating level of sanctions. This is a very typical UK type of response, that you would start off with some fairly low level intervention and then go up the scale. But if you do go up the scale, what is proposed is a bit like the GDPR, the privacy laws in the UK. You start to see turnover-based fines being proposed, and also criminal sanctions against directors of the relevant companies. So if you start to get up to the high end of the sanctions, it becomes very scary indeed. And what we saw when our privacy laws were introduced in 2018 is that those sanctions are what captured the attention of boardrooms and made the market move. In terms of obligations for vulnerability disclosures, each company is required to have a publicly available, clear and transparent vulnerability disclosure policy, reporting to be allowed in an accessible way, and including contact information, obviously, but also timelines. So the process will have to be sketched out. And the reason for this, why have vulnerability disclosure as one of the major aspects of this regulation, is because vulnerabilities or bugs create risks, whether for users or devices or the networks, or also the entire supply chain where you have Internet of Things. And without a way to report those vulnerabilities that is sound and predictable, there's really nowhere for researchers or concerned consumers to go. And failure to respond on the part of manufacturers could end up in a very unfavorable outcome, whether that's disclosure happening publicly or brand damage. So it's best to manage the process if you can, and David will provide much more detail on this. So what we're hoping for is that Through this webinar and the associated quick guide, we will give you a bit of an understanding on vulnerability disclosure, guidance on how to prepare, and best practices.